Mrs. Green and the Little Kitten. In the peaceful village of Pinebrook, there lived an elderly woman named Mrs. Green. Widowed and with her children having moved far away, Mrs. Green led a quiet, solitary life in a small, ivy-covered cottage at the edge of the village. Her days were filled with tending to her garden, reading old books, and occasionally visiting the local market. One crisp autumn morning, as Mrs. Green was gathering firewood from the shed, she heard a faint, pitiful meowing. Curious, she followed the sound to the far corner of her garden, where she found a tiny, shivering kitten huddled under a bush. The kitten was a sad sight, with matted fur and a look of desperation in its big, blue eyes. Mrs. Green's heart melted. She gently scooped up the kitten and cradled it in her arms. "You poor little thing," she murmured. "Let's get you warm and fed." She brought the kitten inside, wrapping it in a soft old blanket, and set about preparing a saucer of warm milk. The kitten eagerly lapped up the milk, purring softly as it began to warm up. Mrs. Green watched with a tender smile. "We'll have to find you a name," she said, stroking its tiny head. "How about Whiskers?" As the days turned into weeks, Whiskers became a constant companion for Mrs. Green. The once frail and frightened kitten grew into a playful, energetic cat, bringing joy and laughter back into Mrs. Green's life. Every morning, Whiskers would follow her around the garden, pouncing on falling leaves and chasing butterflies. In the evenings, he would curl up on her lap as she read by the fireplace. Word of Mrs. Green's newfound companion spread through the village. Her neighbors, who had long worried about her loneliness, were delighted to see her so happy. They often stopped by to visit, bringing treats for Whiskers and enjoying tea with Mrs. Green. One particularly harsh winter, a severe storm hit Pinebrook. The village was blanketed in snow, and the roads became impassable. Mrs. Green's cottage, nestled at the edge of the village, was especially isolated. As the storm raged on, the power went out, plunging the cottage into darkness. Mrs. Green, though well prepared with firewood and candles, found the long, cold nights daunting. But with Whiskers by her side, she felt less alone. The little cat seemed to sense her unease and stayed close, providing comfort with his steady purring. One night, as the wind howled outside, Mrs. Green awoke to find Whiskers pawing at the door. He seemed agitated, his fur standing on end. She got up, wrapped herself in a warm shawl, and opened the door a crack. To her astonishment, she saw a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was a lantern carried by her neighbor, Mr. Benson. Mr. Benson, a kindly man with a thick beard, had braved the storm to check on Mrs. Green. "I was worried about you," he said, stepping inside and shaking off the snow. "I brought some supplies and extra firewood." Grateful and relieved, Mrs. Green welcomed him in. They spent the evening talking by the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Whiskers, content and purring, nestled between them. As the storm finally passed and life in Pinebrook returned to normal, Mrs. Green reflected on how much had changed since Whiskers had come into her life. The little kitten had not only filled her days with joy, but had also rekindled her connection with the community. From that winter onward, Mrs. Green and Whiskers were a familiar sight in Pinebrook. They became a symbol of resilience and companionship, reminding everyone that even in the loneliest times, the love of a small creature could bring warmth and light into their lives. Summary. Mrs. Green and the Little Kitten is a heartwarming tale set in the village of Pinebrook, where an elderly widow named Mrs. Green finds a shivering, abandoned kitten in her garden. Naming him Whiskers, she cares for him and, in turn, finds her own life enriched with joy and companionship. Through their bond, Mrs. Green reconnects with her community and faces the challenges of a harsh winter with newfound strength and support. The story teaches us the profound impact that companionship and kindness can have on our lives. It reminds us that even the smallest acts of care, such as rescuing a helpless animal, can lead to significant positive changes. The bond between Mrs. Green and Whiskers illustrates that love and companionship can overcome loneliness and bring a sense of purpose and happiness, regardless of age or circumstances.